On Thursday evening, a geopolitical event occurred that arguably warrants the lead headline of every major international publication. 20 sovereign nations ratified a collective declaration condemning the Iranian blockade of the Strait of Hormuz and signaling a unified readiness to intervene. The list of signatories is extensive and diverse, yet it is defined by a singular glaring omission: the United States. The strategic implications of this exclusion are profound. The nation that catalyzed the current kinetic conflict, the architect of Operation Epic Fury, is conspicuously absent from the very coalition formed to resolve the fallout. While the White House has spent weeks demanding that its partners deploy naval assets to the Persian Gulf, and while the president has openly threatened the structural future of NATO, should allies fail to comply, those allies have chosen a different path. This is the definitive account of how 20 nations successfully engineered a coalition independent of American command, and why the Canadian administration has emerged as the primary architect of this new geopolitical reality. The details of the March 19, 2026, declaration provide a stark roadmap of the current diplomatic rift. The heads of state from the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Japan, Canada, South Korea, New Zealand, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Slovenia, Czechia, Romania, and Bahrain issued a comprehensive joint communiqué regarding the maritime security of the Strait of Hormuz. In the strongest diplomatic language available, this group condemned the Iranian strikes on unarmed merchant shipping and civilian energy infrastructure. They categorized the closure of the strait, a transit point for 20% of the world's daily petroleum supply, as an unacceptable threat to global peace and economic security. Crucially, they expressed a collective readiness to contribute to appropriate efforts to restore safe passage. This consensus was achieved exactly 3 weeks after the United States launched a unilateral war without the consultation or consent of its primary treaty partners. To understand the weight of this collective action, one must revisit the events of February 28, 2026. The launch of Operation Epic Fury by the United States and Israel, targeting the Iranian military high command and energy hubs, was executed in total isolation. At the time, Washington explicitly informed its European and Pacific partners that their participation was neither required nor requested. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Iran responded by effectively sealing the Strait of Hormuz through a combination of sea mines, drone swarms, and ballistic missile strikes on commercial tankers. Global energy markets entered a state of shock. Crude prices spiked toward $150 a barrel, and European natural gas costs surged by 60% in less than 20 days. As the global economy began to seize up, the administration in Washington executed a sudden pivot, demanding that the very allies it had ignored now provide the military hardware to fix the crisis. The White House's demand for a naval coalition met a wall of institutional resistance. The president publicly threatened that NATO would face a very bad future if members did not immediately dispatch frigates and destroyers to the Gulf. He characterized European caution as a foolish mistake and warned that the United States would maintain a record of those who failed to assist. The response from Allied capitals was unprecedented in its bluntness. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius stated categorically, "This is not our conflict. We did not initiate it." His office further questioned why a handful of European vessels were expected to achieve what the massive technological weight of the U.S. Navy could not. In London, Prime Minister Keir Starmer was equally firm, granting the U.S. only restricted access to British bases for strictly defensive maneuvers, while insisting that any mission in the strait would not be a NATO-sanctioned operation. Tokyo cited constitutional constraints on overseas military deployment, while Madrid was even more direct. Spain's defense ministry asserted that they would not accept stopgap maritime measures, arguing that the only valid objective was an immediate cessation of the war itself. The European Union's foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, summarized the sentiment, noting that no member state was prepared to place personnel in harm's way for a unilateral American campaign. The collapse of Trump's military coalition did not lead to Allied inaction. It led to Allied independence. 48 hours after rejecting the White House's demands, these same 20 nations produced a strategy that was significantly more sophisticated than a simple naval escort. The March 19th statement was not a commitment to combat. It was a commitment to economic and institutional resilience. The agreement focused on 4 key pillars. 1. Uniform condemnation, aligning the diplomatic narrative against the blockade. 2. Multilateral readiness, signifying a willingness to act under international law rather than unilateral command. 3. Strategic resource coordination, supporting the IEA's massive release of petroleum reserves. 4. Market stabilization, working through global financial institutions to manage the inflationary shock. Notice the deliberate omissions. There is no mention of a combined strike group, no endorsement of Operation Epic Fury, and no agreement to integrate with U.S. Central Command. By focusing on managing the economic fallout of a war they did not start, these nations, led by Canada's Mark Carney, chose to act as sovereign entities rather than junior partners. Canada's trajectory over the last 3 weeks provides a blueprint for middle power influence. From the outset, the Carney administration was explicit. Canada would not participate in the offensive maneuvers of Israel or the United States. When the call for warships arrived, Ottawa's response was a study in strategic ambiguity, stating that any support would be governed strictly by Canadian legal frameworks and ongoing consultations with partners. While the U.S. attempted to leverage NATO as a tool of coercion, Carney was in Oslo, standing with German and Norwegian leaders to build a coalition based on shared values and economic security rather than American directives. When the moment arrived to address the Hormuz crisis, Canada was a primary architect of the March 19th statement. The logic was clear. We are ready to assist, but we will do it through institutions, through law, and through coordinated markets, not through the escalation of a conflict we were never consulted on. The 20 nations involved in this statement represent a formidable economic bloc. Japan and South Korea, which derive 90% and 80% of their oil via the strait respectively, have immense skin in the game. Their decision to align with Canada and Europe rather than Washington is a historic indicator of the erosion of American leadership. These nations are no longer waiting for a signal from the White House. They are acting as a unified front, independent of the U.S. security umbrella. When the president threatened the future of NATO, these countries responded by forming a coalition that effectively excludes the United States. This is not a minor diplomatic tiff, it is a structural realignment, where the world's most reliable partners have determined that Washington is the primary source of instability. A sober analysis must acknowledge that the March 19th statement is not a kinetic solution. The Strait of Hormuz remains a combat zone. Oil prices remain at historic, volatile highs. The IEA's release of strategic reserves is a buffer, not a cure. The declaration establishes a political framework, not a military reality. However, the framework itself is the victory. By championing a multilateral approach, one defined by patient coalition building, rather than military ultimatums, the Carney government has created a viable alternative to the White House's bluster. While the U.S. stands increasingly isolated, its closest allies are proving that they can organize international action on their own terms. At the World Economic Forum in Davos earlier this year, Mark Carney warned that great powers were increasingly using economic integration and supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. The Hormuz crisis is the literal manifestation of that warning. A great power initiated a conflict, destabilized a global choke point, and then demanded its allies bear the cost of the cleanup. The response from Canada and its 19 partners was to find a third path. They rejected both the Iranian blockade and the American escalation, choosing instead a coordinated international response that stabilizes markets while upholding the principles of international law. The bottom line of the March 19th declaration is this: 20 nations have agreed on a way forward, and the United States was not invited to lead it. The era where Washington could trigger a global crisis and then dictate the terms of its resolution is over. The world is currently reorganizing itself around shared values, institutional law, and the kind of disciplined diplomacy practiced by the Carney administration since day one. Operation Epic Fury may have been designed in Washington, but the world's response to it was designed in Ottawa, Berlin, and London. The Allies didn't just refuse to follow, they built a new road.